In 1926, a respected Soviet scientist boarded a ship to West Africa. He was going there to do something that had never been done before. Something the world's most powerful government had just given him money to attempt. His plan was to create a creature, half human, half chimpanzee. A creature that would come to be known as the Humanzee. You might have heard a version of this story before, the one with Joseph Stalin and his army of Ape-Men, secret experiments and monsters in cages. That version is a myth. The real story doesn't need any of that, because the real story is more disturbing than the myth itself. His name was Ilya Ivanov, born in 1870 in a small town in Russia. There's nothing unusual about his childhood except for the fact that he was a rising star in biology. He grew up to be a professor and specialized in artificial insemination. By the early 1900s, he had built a reputation that spread across the whole of Europe. Not for anything strange, not yet, but he was famous for horses. Specifically for solving a problem that every farmer in Russia had. See, normal horse breeding works like this. A stallion and a mare have to be in the same location at the same time. The stallion naturally mates with maybe 20 to 30 mares per season, that's the limit. But Ilya figured out how to take a stallion's sperm, preserve it in a lab and manually inject it to hundreds of mares, even in different locations. The numbers went from 30 mares per season to 500. The Russian government used this exact technique to breed thousands of horses for their army. Scientists from across the world came just to watch Ilya's work. He wasn't a fringe character, he became a mainstream in the science community. But Ilya didn't stop there, he kept pushing the limits. He was the kind of scientist who couldn't stop asking how far could this go. So he kept experimenting. He crossed zebra with a donkey, a cow with an antelope, a mouse with a rat. He was systematically testing the limits, which of these species could be forced to produce an offspring under lab conditions that would never happen in the wild. And at some point, standing in his lab surrounded by proof that species boundaries could be moved, he asked the obvious next question. What about humans and apes? Before you call this insane, here's why the scientific community in the early 1900s didn't immediately laugh at his idea. Quick biology, let's keep it simple. Humans and chimpanzees share somewhere between 98 to 99% of their DNA. We are genetically speaking extremely close. Chimps have 48 chromosomes and humans have 46. The difference happened because two ancient ape chromosomes fused together at some point in the evolution. Now a mule is produced by crossing a horse and a donkey. Two different species, different chromosome counts, and yet they produce a living hybrid. Same goes with ligers, lion and tiger. Nature has already proven that sometimes related species can produce an offspring. So in the early 1900s, the question of whether a human-chimpanzee hybrid was biologically possible wasn't obviously insane. It was genuinely open for scientific discussion. In 1917, the Russian Revolution happened. The Bolsheviks took power and started building a completely new country. And like any other country, they had a very specific problem. Russia was deeply religious. The Orthodox Church had enormous influence over people. The new Soviet government wanted to break that influence as fast as possible. The Soviet Union had just launched the League of Militant Atheists. Their goal was simple, to prove that God did not exist and that humans were nothing more than a biological machine. Ilya's experiments was not just a curiosity, it was the ultimate proof. If they could create a Humanzee, they could prove that soul was a myth and Darwin's evolution was the only truth. So when Ilya walked into Academy of Sciences and said, I can prove Darwin was right, I can produce a living piece of evidence that humans evolved from apes, it wasn't just a science proposal, it was a political weapon. Ilya knew that to get funding, he couldn't just talk about biology, he had to talk about power. He pitched his experiments not as a study but as a triple threat weapon for the new Soviet state. First, it was a war on God. If Ilya could create this hybrid, he would provide the ultimate proof for Darwin's theory. It would be a physical blow to the Orthodox Church, proving that humans weren't divine creations. Second, it was a promise of eternal life. At the time, the elite people in Soviet were obsessed with rejuvenation. The idea that animal tissues could be used to stop human aging. Ilya promised that bringing apes to Russia would open doors for secret medical treatments. And third, it was a blueprint for a new socialist man. The Bolsheviks didn't just want to change the government, they wanted to change the human nature itself. They dreamed of a future worker who was stronger, more resilient, and crucially, more obedient than any natural human. Ilya suggested that by crossing species, science could finally engineer the perfect citizen for the state. It was a pitch they couldn't refuse. In November 1926, Ilya and his son arrived at the botanical gardens of Conakry in French Guinea. The plan was straightforward: capture female chimpanzees, inseminate them with human sperm, and wait. But you see, there was a problem. Most of the chimps at the station were young juveniles, infants, and many of them were already weak. They weren't really suitable for the experiment. So the workers on site were sent out to capture adults from the surrounding forest. The methods were brutal even by the standards of the time. They set the forest on fire and chased these animals into cages as they ran away from the smoke. On February 28, 1927, 2 female chimpanzees were inseminated with human sperm. On June 25th, the third one. And then, Ilya waited. The result was no pregnancy. None of the chimps were conceived, not a single one. The failure was personal for Ilya. When one of the inseminated chimps, a female named Bolshaya, died shortly after the procedure, Ilya didn't just mourn the loss of the animal. He immediately performed a cold clinical autopsy. He wasn't looking for a cause of death. He was desperately searching her reproductive organs for any microscopic sign of a hybrid. In the middle of the humid African jungle, standing over a dissected body of an ape, Ilya realized that species barrier was much stronger than his lab experiments. Now, a scientist who hits a dead end has 2 choices: accept the result and move on, or find a reason to keep going. Ilya found a reason. He told himself the conditions had been wrong, the animals were too young, too stressed, and the timing was off. And so, he moved to plan B. If a chimpanzee couldn't be made pregnant with human sperm, what if it worked the other way around? What if a human woman was inseminated with chimpanzee sperm? He intended to perform this at a local hospital in Guinea. He also insisted not telling the women what was actually being done to them. He was going to perform a reproductive experiment using the sperm of a chimpanzee on women who believed they were receiving normal medical care. The French colonial governor of Guinea found out and he shut the experiment down. The colonial governor himself was part of a deeply racist exploitative system, but even he drew a line here. So Ilya packed up, loaded 13 surviving chimpanzees onto the ship, and sailed back to the Soviet Union. When Ilya returned with failed experiments and a scandal already following him, the Soviet government simply told him to keep going with his experiments. He set up a primate research center in Sukhumi, a subtropical region that is now part of modern Georgia. He planned a new phase of his experiment in Soviet soil. But out of the 13 chimpanzees that were shipped from Africa, only 4 survived the journey. And by 1929, every single one of them had died. They were unable to survive the unfamiliar climate. The only chimpanzee that survived was a 26-year-old male orangutan, Tarzan. And so, Ilya started again. He found volunteers for the experiment. Exactly how voluntary this was in 1929 Soviet Russia is a question worth asking. But some accounts say these women came forward out of genuine commitment. However, there are reports that say these women were found among local prisoners. In Stalinist Russia, the difference between a volunteer and someone who has no real choice is not always clear. But for now, we only know the name of one of them. In the historical record, she appears only as the letter G. She had written a letter to Ilya that said,
"Dear Professor, I ask you not to refuse my request. I want to bear an experimental hybrid child."
She had apparently signed it and we don't know what happened to her after that. She disappears from the record completely. Everything was now in place. Ilya had his facility, the volunteers were ready and the new apes were scheduled to arrive in the summer of 1930. But then, two things happened. Tarzan the orangutan suffered a brain hemorrhage and died, and Joseph Stalin's government started to get rid of all the scientists in Soviet. On 13 December 1930, Ilya was arrested, not for his previous experiments but for sabotage.
By the time the Great Purge began, Ilya had become the perfect target. With all those expensive African trips, his connections in France, even the years he spent working with Western scientists, all of it suddenly looked suspicious.
And like that, he was convicted and sentenced to 5 years of exile in Kazakhstan, far away from any lab or any meaningful work. 2 years after the exile, Ilya Ivanov died of a stroke. And with him, the story of Humanzee also disappeared for the next 60 years. The whole thing simply ceased to exist in any official record, until the archives opened again in 1990s. By the time Ilya's story resurfaced, the world had already spent 2 decades obsessing over a different possible Humanzee. His name was Oliver. Oliver was a chimpanzee acquired from Congo by 2 American trainers named Frank and Janet Berger. And from the moment they got him, they knew something was different. Oliver walked upright, not occasionally the way other chimps do to show off. He was constantly on 2 legs, and with walking style that looked disturbingly human. His face was flatter than a normal chimp. He was bald on top. He had a different smell, so different that other chimpanzees would simply reject him. He used to drink coffee and prefer the company of humans over other apes. Someone even claimed without real evidence that Oliver had 47 chromosomes, 1 more than a human and 1 less than a chimp, which would place him exactly between the 2 species. For so many years, nobody could prove what Oliver was. Then in 1996, a man named David Ledbetter tested Oliver's DNA properly and found 48 chromosomes, identical to every other chimpanzee. And so, Oliver was a chimp, a very unusual chimp. He was no Humanzee. Until the test results came, Oliver was living in a small cage at a lab. He had spent 9 years in a space so small that his muscles had started to atrophy. His limbs got weak. He was mostly blind. He had arthritis. The most famous possible human chimp had spent a decade in a box. He was eventually rescued and moved to a sanctuary in Texas. And when he was at least 55 years old in 2012, he died in his sleep. In April 2021, a team of scientists from United States, China and Spain published a paper. They had taken 132 monkey embryos that were 6 days old, and into each one they injected 25 human stem cells, the kind of cells that can develop into any tissue in the body. The human cells didn't die. They integrated, they started communicating with the monkey cells. Even after 13 days, the human cells were still present and active in about 1 in 3 of the embryos. The experiment was run for 20 days, but then all the embryos were destroyed. The researchers were very clear this was not an attempt to create a Humanzee. The goal was medical. If they can get human cells to grow inside an animal, they may one day be able to grow human organs inside pigs or other animals and use them for transplants. That, my friends, was the insane story of Humanzee. If you learned something new from this video, please do like and subscribe. And until the next video, take care.